Alrighty, well, as you guys saw in the poll there, and as Liz has already mentioned there, we're going to be talking about how to migrate your VMs to Azure with PowerShell. This is actually going to be a kind of a global conversation about virtual machines in general, not necessarily just VMs that have SQL Server on them, but any VMs that you happen to have in your environment. And based on the poll that we had there, I believe the combined group of people who are already looking to move to Azure and the people who are just talking about it made up, I think it was 61% and 22%. So a little bit over 80% of the folks on the webinar today are actually either already in the process of moving to Azure or are actually considering a move to Azure. So hopefully I'll answer some of the questions that you guys have about Azure VMs today, and you'll actually get to see how to actually move some of these virtual machines up to the Azure environment as well. So on the screen there, you'll see my contact information. I'll also have it up again at the end of the session here. I have a notepad document that I'm going to be copying and pasting some scripts out of. So we'll take a look at each one of the different PowerShell commands that I'm going to run. Don't worry about going out there and necessarily writing down each one of these different commands that I run. I'm actually going to take the entire script that I use today, and I have a blog post that I'm going to be putting up. We'll have it have it linked out there with a recording back to the session today, so in case you miss anything on this. But it'll also have a list of each one of the different commands that we're going to run throughout this entire presentation today. So that way you can actually go back and you can use these in your environment. Just replace the, as you'll see as we go through there's going to be some instances where we reference different storage container names, those type of things. Just change out the names for whatever works for your environment, and you'll actually be able to take these same scripts that we're going to use today and possibly even be able to go ahead and move one of your VMs up into the Azure environment. All right, so real quick, just a little bit about myself. I do a lot of webinars here for Pragmatic Works. I also do a lot of our workshops, so I'm frequently out there speaking in the community, doing SQL Saturdays, that kind of stuff. When I'm not doing speaking or doing training for Pragmatic Works, I'm actually a consultant for them as well. So I do consulting and training there at Pragmatic. I live down in nice sunny Jacksonville, Florida, sunny for today anyway. And frequently do a lot of stuff in the southeast, but whenever I'm traveling around the country doing training events and those type of things, I like to pop into user groups and stuff as I'm going around. So I was also up at Summit a couple of weeks ago, so that was always a good time out there. So I'm all over the place. Check out my blog there if you want to at bradleyshack.com. There's a lot of SQL Server stuff. I mainly focus on BI as well as BI, SharePoint, and the APS Analytic Platform System there from Microsoft. So I've got a lot of content out on my blog about those things. And I also try to keep that updated anytime I'm going to go someplace else, and I'll be speaking places, so I try to keep it updated with that information as well. All right, so kind of the story that we're going to try to tell today, I think it's a little bit easier to go through and talk about these VMs inside of Azure and kind of tell it as a story, why we would want to actually do this. What's the problem that we're trying to solve? What are some of the potential solutions? And then why would you use Azure as opposed to using some other, why not just use regular VMs on-prem, or maybe just use regular SQL servers on-prem? So the kind of the story we're going to be going through is, let's talk about small to medium-sized companies, because you're going to see a lot of bang for your buck in this kind of area if you're a small to medium-sized company. That doesn't mean if you're working with a big company that you can't go to Azure or use virtual machines in general. But we see a lot of small and medium-sized companies, as well as departments, individual departments inside of larger companies also start to use virtualization in general, just because it's a lot easier to virtualize environments than it is to necessarily procure hardware and worry about maintaining that hardware and building out the environment and paying for the electricity to power the servers and cooling inside of your data centers, and then you've got to actually pay for the space in your data center and all these different things. So it's not just the fact that you have to go buy the hardware and you have to maintain the hardware. There's a whole lot of other things that go along with it. So hopefully, if any of you guys have ever been involved in the infrastructure side of things, there's a lot more that goes into keeping these servers running than just going out there, swiping your credit card, and ordering the server, and it shows up at the doorstep a couple weeks later. There's a lot more that goes into it. So it really becomes a very large capital investment to not only get the servers originally, but then to also keep your data centers running day in and day out. You know, it's personnel, it's, like I said, it's power, it's cooling, it's all those different types of things there as well. So we as a company, and this is actually, you know, when we're putting this session together, this is actually a story that makes sense for a lot of companies and really hit home for us, because at Pragmatic Works, we actually use Azure, and this kind of use case that we're talking through here is a perfect example of what we actually use at Pragmatic Works. We actually use Azure virtual machines for. So we decided, you know, we don't want to spend all of our time and all of our money focusing on maintaining that hardware. We wanted to be able to focus more on the business side of things, focus on our customers. In the case that we'll talk through, and some of the examples that you'll see that I'm going to go through here, we actually use these same things for our training department. So anytime that we offer a particular class where we say that we're going to provide a machine for our students to log into, we don't ship out laptops, or we don't you know, necessarily make a bunch of VMs locally and have everybody VPN into our office. We actually just spin up a few Azure VMs that already have SQL Server on them, that already have SharePoint on them, have whatever software we need for that particular class. So, you know, it's not necessarily just for a training situation like this. I've got several customers that I've worked with in the past who actually use Azure so that they can do a development, test, and QA environments. So that way, each one of those environments looks the same, and it's easy to turn them on. It's easy to turn them off whenever they don't need them. So we can spend more of our time and money focusing on the business rather than focusing on keeping those servers running. So again, customers use that all the time for spinning up development virtual machines, or you know, if we want to do load testing today or tomorrow, we can take that virtual machine, we can add a bunch of extra resources to it, or we can pull resources back when we're not using it quite as much. So it's a little bit more flexible than just having, you know, buying development hardware, buying test hardware, and having it laying around unused potentially inside of our data centers. So ultimately, as you can see there, we've kind of determined that the best solution for us is to virtualize. Okay, so we've got two possible solutions there when we start talking about virtualizing our servers. We can either do on-prem virtualization, and that can come in a variety of ways. It doesn't have to be Hyper-V inside of Windows, although that's what I'll be using today as a Hyper-V image. But that could also come through a variety of other software vendors. So I think probably the most common one that you're going to see out there is probably VMware. So we can virtualize on-prem, but we still end up with some of the same problems. So some of the same problems that we end up with when we buy regular hardware and just use dedicated hardware for each of our use cases. So whether that's VMs that we're doing development on, or whether that's a dev, test, QA environments, those type of things, we end up with a lot of those same problems when we virtualize on-prem. Because when you virtualize on-prem, it doesn't take everything out of the picture. You still have to have hardware to host those virtual machines on. Okay, so we still have to maintain some set of hardware. It's much less hardware than what you would have to maintain if you were going to use, you know, it's much less hardware to maintain than if you were to buy separate servers, but it is still things that you have to worry about maintaining. The other option, which obviously we'll look at today, is cloud virtualization, and the one we're going to focus on is obviously going to be Azure. Okay, so some of the things we'll talk about here, they do still apply to other cloud services as well, but we're going to focus on the Azure side of things. Okay, so again, we as a company at Pragmatic Works, we've decided, hey, we want to spend less money maintaining hardware. We want to spend more of our time developing good training material. So we're going to take all these VMs that we usually dedicate out there for our students. We're going to push them up to the cloud. We're going to virtualize that. We're going to push those up to the cloud. So there's a couple of reasons why you might want to go with Azure as opposed to either another solution or just as opposed to the on-prem. First of all, whether you guys realize it or not, most of you are actually probably getting Azure credit through your Microsoft service agreements. So a lot of the enterprise agreements, those service agreements that you have with Microsoft for your SQL Server licensing or for your Windows licensing, a lot of those actually have Azure credits built into them. They may not be available for use as production environments, but a lot of them do have those credits built in. So you may actually have some free Azure credit out there that you're just not even taking advantage of right now. And you could clearly, or you could easily use that for your development environments or some of these other use cases that we'll look at. Another big advantage of going to Azure is
Brad.
the agile infrastructure. Yeah.
Is your PowerPoint supposed to be moving?
No, it's still on the our story slide right now.
Just wanted to check. Thanks.
Yep. So on the agile infrastructure side, so we have the ability to add and remove resources very, very easily. So in our environment, if we were to do things locally, if we wanted to go in and let's say that we wanted to add additional CPU or add additional memory, that's a really big undertaking. Inside the Azure environment, all you do is you go click a couple of buttons and it's got more resources out there. So you don't even have to worry about buying additional hardware. You just kind of go out there, you scale it up, scale it down as necessary, and away you go. It's also built-in redundancy, so we can have storage that's geo-redundant across different data centers, so we don't have to worry about maintaining our production environment and our DR environment. All that stuff is kind of handled for us inside those cloud environments there. Okay, and then the last thing is, it's really nice to just be able to pay for what you use, honestly. Again, we've got companies that go out and they buy these huge amounts of hardware for development and test environments when they really only use them a fraction of the time. So we can actually go out in Azure and we only have to pay for the amount of compute that we use. We only have to pay for the amount of storage that we use. So we can really, a lot of times, it actually is more cost effective to move up into the cloud. All right, so now we've kind of talked about why we might want to virtualize, why we might want to go to Azure. Here's what we're gonna talk through 4 different things today. The first one is going to be, how do we actually prepare to move up to the Azure environment? So that's going to be a set of things that we need to do in our on-premise environment there. Okay, so there is a little bit of work that we have to do, just some preparation things, a couple of little gotchas, make sure that you're aware of those so that you don't set up your on-prem environment, get ready to go migrate up to Azure, and then you find out, hey, none of my stuff works. The next thing we're going to do is talk to you about how to actually prepare your Azure environment. So we're going to kind of start from the point of, hey, I've already got a subscription going, and we'll kind of go from that point. So I'm not going to show you how to actually set up an Azure subscription. It's super easy. You're basically just a credit card away. Go in there, create your account, link your credit card to it. You don't have to have it automatically charge your credit card. You can tell it that once you're done with all your Azure credit, that it automatically shuts everything down for you. But getting an actual Azure account, if you have a Microsoft ID already, then you've already got an Azure account basically. The next piece, we'll actually show you how to move to Azure. So we'll get ready, prepare for the migration, set up our on-prem stuff, prepare Azure, get ready to move everything up to Azure. Then I'll show you how to actually move into the Azure environment. And then I'll show you a couple of cool little things as we wrap up, just things to how to make the solution a little bit more flexible for you. Okay. So as we're preparing for our migration, there's a few things that we need to do and a few things that we need to be aware of. The first thing we have to do, and this is something we have to do on each one of the virtual machines that we want to upload, is that we have to run sysprep on each one of those VMs. We actually only have to run sysprep on the VMs if we want to use it as an image, and there's actually 2 options when we do these uploads. We can upload just a disk, or we can upload an image. And I'll talk about the difference between those 2 here in just 1 second. But essentially what happens for sysprep is what we use to allow us to duplicate that disk inside of Azure. What that means to us is if we have a virtual machine that already has SQL Server, already has all the tools that we need for development, all those type of things, we don't have to go and do that install 5 different times. We can actually do that install 1 time, run sysprep, and then make 5 copies of the disk image once it's already, 5 copies of that image once it's inside the Azure environment. So it's a real time saver there. And essentially that's what we're using whenever we do this for our training classes, is we have 1 image that has everything on it. We generalize it using sysprep, and then however many students we have in a class, that's how many versions of this VM we're going to spend. So I mentioned that it's only required if you want to duplicate the VMs. If you just want to If you just want to upload the VHD and then create one VM off of that, you don't actually have to run sysprep. Sysprep is going to go in and wipe out all the system level kind of configurations that you've done. So if you have a domain controller out there, for instance, you don't want to run sysprep and then generalize that VM, because what's going to happen is it's going to take all those domain controller settings away from you. Okay? What this essentially is going to do is make it like it's the first time you're turning on the computer every time you start up the VM, except for it's going to already have all your tools and everything installed. Okay? So only run sysprep if you want to be able to make an image and therefore duplicate that image multiple times. If you only want to use one version of that VM in Azure, then you don't have to run sysprep, but you can only use it as a disk. That's really the differentiator between disk and image. Images we can use multiple times. Disks we can only use one. Okay. The way that we're actually going to handle doing all these different commands for creating our storage accounts and uploading things to Azure, we're going to do that all through the PowerShell and Azure command line. So I'll show you actually how to download that and install that, and then I'll also show you some of these things inside of Azure so you can see what that looks like inside the Azure environment. The trick, though, is that not everything is available to you inside of the management portal. Some things that we're going to do, we have to perform through the PowerShell command line interfaces, one of those two there. Then finally, a couple of little limitations here, just to be aware of. You'll notice that first one that we have on there is that it can't be a VHDX. It has to be a VHD. I don't know when they're going to start supporting VHDX as an upload option for Azure, but I would expect to see that at some point in the future. I just don't have any idea as to when they'll be able to do that. The nice thing, though, is that if we do have a VHDX, there's a real simple PowerShell command that we can run that will convert that over to a VHD for us. All right, the final thing there, OS hard disk size. So whenever we go to upload this VM, it does have to be the operating system disk. We can still attach other disks to the VM, but the actual disk that has the OS on it has to be 127 gigabytes or smaller. Okay, so just keep that in mind. Your OS hard disk does have to be 127 gigs or smaller. It can't be any larger than that. Otherwise, it's not going to upload and it's not going to run inside the Azure environment there. So just keep that in mind. OS hard disk has to be 127 gigs or smaller. If you have a dynamically expanding disk, whenever you go to upload that, it's automatically going to expand that to the full size. The reason that's important to us is because I can set the maximum size on my dynamically expanding disk to pretty much anything I want. So the reason that's super important is if I go in and I create a dynamically expanding disk and I say that the max size of this disk is 250 gigs. When I get ready to upload that disk to Azure, it's going to convert that over to a fixed size disk. And what that's going to do is it's going to take the entire allocation, all 250 gigs, and it's going to make one disk out of that 250 gigs. So that's immediately going to violate that OS hard disk size of a max of 127 gigabytes. So just be careful if you do have a dynamically expanding disk. Those are perfectly valid to use. Nothing wrong with using those. Just know that whenever you do go to upload that, whatever you set that maximum size to is what it's going to use as your as the largest size of the disk. It's going to automatically expand it to that full size. All right, so let's go ahead and take a look at a couple of those things that we just mentioned in there, downloading the Azure command line, running sysprep, and then I'll actually show you how to convert a VHDX over to a VHD. All right, so I've actually got, again, this is the Notepad document. I said don't worry about running or copying all this stuff down or worrying about any of that. I'm actually going to post this out on my blog once we get done with this webinar here. But just to show you, so a couple things we mentioned there, sysprep, we always have to run sysprep on our images if we want to be able to create an image and reuse it over and over again. That's going to be located at C Windows System 32 and then sysprep. And this is something that you have to run on the actual VM there. Okay. So I'm going to I'm going to launch this prep here, and then the key to remember is to always check this generalize button. That's what you want to do. You want out-of-box experience and then generalize. And again, what that's going to do is going to wipe away all that system identification type information, make it as though it's essentially the first time that you turn on the computer. So if you were to go on Amazon and order a new laptop, or go out to Best Buy and you were to buy a laptop there, that first time that you turn the computer on, it's going to run through a few little things like, what's your name, what do you want your computer name to be, all those type of things. This is essentially going to put that VM into that same state. The other couple options that we have down here at the bottom are to reboot, quit, or shut down. So this is going to say, after it runs the out-of-box experience, do I want to reboot this VM? Do I want to shut down the VM? Or do I just want to quit this application and then have it go into out-of-box experience next time I start the virtual machine? What you probably want to do in this case is either quit or shut down, because reboot is obviously going to shut the VM down and then just start it back up, which is going to be a little anti-productive, since we ultimately want to then upload this. So what you're going to want to do, out-of-box experience, generalize, and then my preference there would be to do shut down. Okay. So we're not going to run that on my laptop here, because that would go very poorly. What we are going to do is I'll show you here where to download the actual PowerShell command that's from. So I've got a link here. There's a little documentation page out on out there for the different Azure PowerShell commands and all this stuff here. So if you go to the link, there's this web platform installer that'll actually download the Azure PowerShell pieces. You'll see another link here for the Azure command line. A lot of the same functionality in there, but we're going to actually use the PowerShell commands today. Okay. I also do have in here, I have the link for the individual. This is the direct link to the download for that web installer, so I'll provide that to you guys as well. All right. Last thing we're going to do in this particular, inside this particular demo here, is I'm actually going to show you guys how to take a VHDX and convert it over to just a regular VHD. So I'm going to go ahead and copy this, and I will show it to you here in 1 second. But what I have out here right now is this VM called myvm.vhdx. And like we said, we can't upload VHDX. We have to upload a VHD. So what I'm going to do, I've already got the Azure stuff installed. So I'm actually going to come over here, and I'm just going to type in Azure. And I'm going to launch Microsoft Azure PowerShell. So this is going to be our Azure PowerShell environment here. It looks just like regular PowerShell. All your normal PowerShell command lists will work here. You can also launch regular PowerShell and just add the snap-in for the Azure commands. Either way works. But for our purposes here, we're going to go ahead and just do everything here in the Azure PowerShell. If you click Start and you type in Azure here and you don't see Azure PowerShell pop up, make sure you go to that link that I've got here in these notes and you download and install the Azure PowerShell command, or the Azure PowerShell. Okay? So that's ultimately what gets us this piece here. So first thing we want to do again is convert this VHDX over to a VHD. So again, I've got this command here, copy it and paste it. And you'll see, real simple command. What we're going to say is we're going to say convert VHD, give it the source, and then give it the destination. Okay? So convert VHD, source, that's our VHDX. Destination is without the VHD, and I'll go ahead and run this. Go ahead and minimize that so we can see this work in the background here for us. And in just a second, what you'll see happen here, hopefully, maybe. There we go. So it actually is going to go and you'll see it says converting virtual disk. This one's a real small VM. It's only a 1 gig VM there. You can see slightly smaller than what our VHDX was, but ultimately there's our new VHD that we had out there. Okay, so everything's the same as what we had in the VHDX. It just converts it down to the regular VHD format, which we can then use inside of our Azure environment. Okay, so at this point, everything's good to go. We've got our disk. It's smaller than 127 gigs. It's got our OS on it. We've already run the out-of-box experience and generalized that VM. We converted it over to a regular VHD, and now we're done with our on-prem preparation, and we're ready to do our Azure preparation. Okay, so on-prem pieces are already configured and all ready to go. Not a whole lot to do there, just a couple of things again to keep in mind as we're going through. On the Azure side, okay, so again, we have to have an Azure account. That's essentially just going to be your subscription, whatever your credit card is going to be tied to that. That's how how Microsoft's actually going to bill you for all the compute time that you use, all the storage time that you're going to use. So no big deal to set that up, really, really easy. You can actually go out and start a free trial for Azure and get a little bit of credit out there. Any of your MSDN subscriptions that you have, those have Azure credit built into them as well. And again, check your EA. Those agreements with Microsoft and CVS might have some free Azure credit with those as well. Once we have our Azure account set up, the next thing we're going to need is a storage account. So the storage account is where we're actually going to store our VHD. So we've got that 127 gig maximum file there. We actually have to put it someplace, obviously. So that's going to go into a storage account. Doing the storage account is something we can either do through PowerShell or through the UI. I'll actually hop back and forth so you guys can see what's happening in the UI as I run each of these PowerShell commands. That little command that we just ran a moment ago to switch that VHDX to a VHD, that's only available in PowerShell. We don't have the ability to do that through a UI of any kind. Okay, so just keep that in mind. The next couple of steps that we're going to do here, we can do through the UI, but I want to show you how to do this through scripts so that you can hopefully automate this in the future. The last thing you see on the screen there, we're going to set the storage account. Essentially, all we're going to do is set a context. So from that point, any commands that we run, so when we run our upload command, we've already got it. We're basically telling it what storage account do we want to actually upload this file into. So just a command that says, here's the storage account that we're going to use, because all the commands that we're going to use after that, they don't allow you to specify a storage account. You have to set the context for the storage account inside the PowerShell command there. Okay? So let's actually hop over and look at actually creating a storage account inside of Azure, or inside PowerShell. I'll show you what that does inside of Azure, and then we'll walk through actually getting that VHD uploaded here once we get done preparing that Azure environment. All right, so what we have on the screen here, this is actually, I just went to manage.windowsazure.com. This is actually my Azure management portal here. So you'll see if I come over here into my storage, we've actually already got 41 storage accounts out here. So we have a ton of storage accounts already. But for argument's sake here, we actually want to go ahead and we want to create ourselves a new storage account, because this is my VM, or maybe it's my department's VM. We don't want to have to go to some other department storage account and mess with their storage. We want to be able to create our own and manage our own access to it and everything. Okay. What we're going to do here is, first things first, I'm going to use this get Azure publish settings file. What this is going to allow me to do when I paste this in here is this is actually going to be how we tell the Azure PowerShell commands what instance of Azure to connect to. Okay, so I can have multiple Azure accounts tied to my Windows login, and this is what's going to actually tell it, what storage accounts am I connecting to, what subscription am I connecting to inside of Azure. So you'll notice that whenever I ran that, what happened was it actually popped open another window here, and normally what it would do, I'm actually logged into my Azure account right now. I completely forgot that it wasn't going to do this for me. But normally what that does, whenever I hit enter and I actually run that command there, is it's going to pop open a little authentication window here. It's going to ask me to put in my email address. It's going to ask me to put in my password. And then it's going to bring me to this screen here, because then I've logged into the Azure environment and it knows what account I'm actually logging into. What you noticed there was it actually downloaded this little file in the background at the same time. So if I go over to my downloads folder here, you can see there that downloaded the file there at 11:28 a.m. So it's 11:29 now. And what this actually has in it, if we look at this inside Notepad++, is there's not a ton of information, but it does have management certificate. That's essentially all my connection string information that it needs to authenticate me into my Azure environment. The name of my subscription happens to be pay-as-you-go. If you have multiple subscriptions, I only have access to the one subscription inside Pragmatic Works. If we had multiple subscriptions, those would have different names in there, and we would just tell it which subscription we wanted to connect to, and then a little bit of other connection information just for authentication purposes here. Okay. So what we've got now is we have this little we have this little credentials published settings file downloaded on our computer. And that's what, again, is going to tell us how to connect to the Azure environment inside PowerShell. The next thing we need to do is actually use that file. So if I go back over here into my little demo folder that I've got all my scripts and everything in, you'll see I've actually got another copy of that. I've just stripped the data out of it and everything. All the information should be the same between the two, but I happen to know this one has all my connection information inside of it. So now that I've downloaded those published settings, again, those are just my connection, it's just all my connection information. The next command that we want to run here is going to be import that published settings file and then the location where the file is actually stored at. Okay? So I'm going to go ahead and just click enter, push enter here, and you'll see there it's connecting to my account. You can see the account that it actually connected to was my pay-as-you-go subscription, and away we go. So now any PowerShell commands that I run are going to be run just as if I'm right here inside my normal Azure management portal. So that means if I want to see a list of all the storage accounts and I tell it to get storage accounts and get me the list of them, it's going to list these 41 storage accounts here. If I tell it I want to see all the SQL databases, it's going to show me these 18 SQL databases that we have in here. Okay? So all that file is doing is telling us what credentials we're actually going to connect to, just as though you were going into the web browser and clicking the, going to manage.windowsazure.com and then typing in your username and password there. Same exact thing, just that's how we do it in PowerShell here. The nifty thing about that little published settings file is now that I've imported it, if I were to reboot my computer, I actually wouldn't have to do that ever again. The next time I actually log into my computer, because I've already imported that Azure published settings file, it actually knows which Azure account I'm already supposed to be connecting to. So I don't actually have to do that again unless I need to switch over to a different subscription potentially. So again, restart my computer, fire up Azure PowerShell, and then just start writing code and interacting with my Azure account then. Okay? There are a few other ways that you can connect into Azure using get credentials and those type of things, but they're a lot more, they're more messy than what we're doing here. So that's really the easiest way to get connected into your Azure environment there is to get the Azure published settings file and then to import that file. All right. The next piece that we want to do here is we want to create ourselves a new storage account. So again, this is going to be the location where my VM is actually going to be stored inside the Azure environment. Okay. So if we go here into Azure, I'm going to create one that's called bshacked Azure VM. Okay. So you'll notice that it doesn't already exist inside of here. If we look at the PowerShell for this, again, pretty simple PowerShell here. New storage account, give it the name and the location. I want this in the eastern U.S. data center there. There's, I think, 11 data centers now for Azure, somewhere around there. That's a complete guess just based on the map I've seen, but you can specify East or East US 2, or there's a couple of data centers in Asia, data centers in Japan. So wherever you happen to want your data to be located, that's what the location here is going to be. Which data center am I actually creating this inside of? So I'm going to go ahead and run this. And that's going to take just a moment to run here, but what you'll probably see, depending on how well this is going to update, this storage number here is probably going to change from 41 to 42 here in just a minute. You'll see it's actually going in and creating this. And what this is doing in the background, I'll kind of give you guys an idea of how you would do this through the UI. So what this is doing in the background is essentially the equivalent of me coming in here and doing new, and then navigating over here to data, going to storage, going to quick create, giving it a name, giving it an affinity group and the location and all that kind of information. That's basically what this PowerShell command here is doing in the background right now. It's going in, it's creating a storage account named bshacked Azure VM and putting it inside the Eastern US location there. So this is one of those steps that we can do one of two ways, either through PowerShell or we can do it through the UI. The one thing I will caution you about that I I found out recently, and there you can see in the background, you see that it switched over from 41 to 42. The one thing I will caution you about is that that storage account name has to be unique. A lot of the names inside of Azure have to be unique inside of your subscription. The interesting thing about this one is that it has to be unique inside of all of Azure, okay? So if somebody else already has a storage account out there called bshacked Azure VM, I'm going to get an error message in here when trying to create this, okay? So it does have to be unique inside of all of Azure. All right, so there we can see we have 42 storage accounts now. There's my bshacked Azure VM. There's that storage account, and this is where we're going to go and upload all of our data going forward. The next script that we want to run here, we have one more thing that we need to do. Here in order to before we upload our VM into the Azure environment. So I'm going to run this command here: set Azure subscription pay as you go, and then current storage account bshacked Azure. All this is really doing for us is telling, again, just setting context. So a lot of the commands, like the next command that you see in the background here, is we're going to run a command that says, create me a new Azure storage container. So inside of this storage account, I want to create a container. You can think of containers just as folders. So we're basically saying, on my C drive, I want to create another folder called virtual machines. That's basically what this next command is going to do for us. So I'll go ahead and copy that. But what you don't see on this PowerShell command here is there's no storage account. So where is it actually going to create this virtual machines container, or this virtual machines folder? Well, that's what this previous command is going to do for us here. It's basically, again, setting the context. So when we connected to Azure, we're basically saying everything that we run is going to be run against my subscription. When we say set Azure subscription and then say current storage account, that's telling us that any time that we interact with storage, it's going to go against this bshacked Azure VM account. Okay? So I'm going to go ahead and run this. And you'll see there, it just created my container called virtual machines. And if we hop back over into Azure, I can go over to containers. And there you'll see that I have now a virtual machines container. I can drill into this here, and you'll see that there's no data actually stored inside of here. Okay? So all we've done at this point is we've created a storage account, but the storage account doesn't actually have any data inside of it. We have a folder where we're going to upload this VM into called virtual machines, a folder or a container, but it doesn't actually have any data inside of it just yet. That's actually going to be the next step that we go through here. So at this point, we've gotten everything on-prem ready to go. We've converted our VHD. We've prepared everything inside of Azure. We've created that storage account. We've created our Azure subscription. And now we're ready to actually move our VM into that storage container that we just created. All right, so uploading a VHD is pretty quick. You'll see there's only really one command. It's called add Azure VHD there. Essentially what we're going to do is, if you haven't already imported that configuration file, we're gonna do that so we can connect to our Azure environment. Obviously we've already done that. And then the next thing we're going to do here is we're going to upload this into Azure, and then we're actually going to create a virtual machine disk out of it. So there's two steps here. The first step is just going to be to get the data into Azure. The next step is going to be to actually make that disk usable inside of our virtual machine. So everything up until right about this step here, uploading the VHD into Azure, it hasn't really had anything to do with VMs specifically. Once we get this file uploaded into that storage container, then we're going to start looking at VM-specific operations at that point. Okay. So the next thing we're going to do here is this add Azure VHD command. And I'm going to go ahead and, again, notice our container is empty here. I'm going to go over into PowerShell. I'm going to paste this command here, maybe. I'm going to go ahead and run that. And what you'll see is it's doing a little bit of work there. It's hashing that VHD file. It's going to go through and it's going to detect empty blocks, so basically empty space inside the VM there, so it doesn't have to upload a 1 gig file. It only has to upload, since this VM happens to be empty, it's going to upload just one block. And basically what it's doing right now is it's actually analyzing the disk, it's hashing it, and it's doing an upload into my Azure storage account. So what it has done is it's taken this myvm.vhd and it has copied it into this storage container here and put it into the virtual machines blob. So I'm going to refresh this page. And once this page refreshes, here, you'll see I'm back in my virtual machines container. And when we get done here, you'll see a 1 gig file inside of here called myvhd. So there's a 1 gig file called myvhd, and then there's the time that it was uploaded. So it was uploaded at 11:40:02 a.m. today. So that's basically what this command here is going to do. Again, this VM that I've got that I just uploaded was 1, pretty small, and 2, just a blank disk. So we're not actually going to be able to create a VM off of it. But I did want to show you guys how to actually upload that VM there using that PowerShell command. All we do is we tell it where it is locally, where we actually want to store that. So there you can see that bshacked Azure VM, and then the virtual machine, so the directory that I'm going to store it in, or the container, and then what we want it to be called whenever it's uploaded there. Okay, so real easy to do that upload. I will caution you though, these do take a long time to upload. If you have a 100 gig, disk that has actually 100 gigs worth of data on it, it's going to take quite a while to upload. You don't want to sit there and just wait for it to upload. It's probably one of those things you want to kick off at the end of the day and then come back in the morning and hopefully it's done. All right, so at this point we have our VHD inside of our storage account. The next thing that we need to do, so we've been working in the storage accounts piece here this whole time. The next thing we want to do is talk about how that relates over to our actual VMs. Okay, so we have the disk stored up in Azure. Next thing I want to do is I'm actually going to skip over this section here, since I know it's been a little bit funny. And I'll show you these couple of PowerShell commands here to actually create an Azure disk. Okay, I'm not actually going to run these because, like I said, I know this copy command. I tried it earlier today, and it took about 40 minutes to copy instead of the usual about 4 minutes that it takes. But this is essentially the command that we would use to set up an Azure disk. And keep in mind, remember what we said earlier, the difference between a disk and an image is that disks are one-time use, images are reusable. So once I have that VHD uploaded, if I want to create a disk out of it, all I have to do is say add Azure disk, tell it the operating system type, and then tell it where that VM, where that VHD, you can see it wraps around there, is actually stored, and then the disk name. Okay? So if I were to run this command here, what it would do is inside my VM section here, if I pop over to disk, you'll see I've got a ton of disks inside of here, but I would see one show up in here called development VM. Once I have that development VM disk created inside of here, I would then run this next command that I have here that's called new Azure VM, and this is where I tell it, things like how much memory and CPU is going to be allocated to this, and then I also tell it what the name of the disk is, where I want it located, all that kind of information, and it will actually spin up my VM for me here. So again, since I don't have time to let this whole thing copy, I'm not actually going to run this new Azure VM piece, but I am going to show you here in just a second how to actually spin up a VM using an image. So I do want to show you guys how to actually make one of these VMs. I'm not going to do a whole session here on migrating your VMs to Azure and not actually show you a VM inside of Azure. Rest assured. Okay. So again, I'll put these out here for you guys to be able to use. But that's first step, upload your disk. Step 2, create a disk using this command here. And then step 3 is to actually create your Azure VM. Once you actually have that VHD uploaded into your storage container, though, we can come in here and we can do those 2 PowerShell commands, the creating disk and the creating instance. We can do those 2 manually. So if I click create down here at the bottom, you'll see it's going to allow me to create a VHD. All I have to do is go find that bshacked Azure VM, go to virtual machines here, select that one, give this some name, and then tell it that it's a Windows OS. Okay, so I can create that there. Obviously, I'm not going to be able to spin up a VM on that because it doesn't actually have an operating system on it. But if after a minute or two here, it's going to create that disk, and it's always going to reference that storage account there in the background. All right, so the last piece that I want to show you guys here is, and again, I'll show you how to actually spin up an actual VM using in this next section here, but I want to talk to you guys a little bit more about images, because that's really where the core functionality for everything really gets extended and becomes really, really usable for you. Is once we can create an image, and then we can ultimately use that many times over. Okay. So an image always still references, just like your disk does that you saw me go in there and create, an image is always going to reference a VHD that we have stored someplace. Again, the difference between that disk and this image, though, is that the image has to have that out-of-box experience and that generalized option run on it through sysprep. I could have very easily just uploaded a regular disk up to my Azure account and not even worried about running out-of-box experience, but I would only be able to use that for one VM. I wouldn't be able to use this situation like we talked about earlier, where if I have 10 students coming into a class, I can spin up 10 different versions of that VM. I would only be able to use that VM one time, and then after that, I would have to go and upload a second VM, and so on and so forth. So it doesn't really scale well for us in that situation. And ultimately, what we want to do is be able to scale this solution to work for all of our students and save us some time, or work for our development and test environments to save us time from having to build those all out. So I'll show you how to create an image using a disk that we've actually already got uploaded that has a full operating system and everything on it. And then I'll actually show you how to use some PowerShell to duplicate that. And again, we'll post that code online, make sure that you guys have that to be able to use as well. And then the last thing there, some really cool stuff with Azure Automation. I'll show you a few things that you can do in there. I'm not actually going to run through it all, and I'll tell you why when we get there. But let's go ahead and walk through how to actually, now that we have that VHD uploaded, let's talk about how to make that into an image, and then how to actually duplicate. All right, so the data that we're actually going to use for this next piece here, if I can hop over into one of my other storage accounts here. So I've actually got this, we have a storage account here called PW Training. Okay? And inside this container, again, we have our VHDs, we called ours virtual machines in the last demo there. But inside this VHDs, I've got a few different VMs or hard drives that I've actually uploaded. So we've got one for all the boot camps that we do. We have another version of that one that we use. SP SQL BI, that one's already got. You see it's called Class Ready, so that one's already got SharePoint on it and everything. So it's got a lot of different things already configured on it. But if we have 10 students in the class, again, we want to be able to easily spin up 10 versions of that particular VM there. So the next thing that we're going to do here is I'm going to, let me actually switch my account here. So I'm going to switch my context. Oops, I copied too much. Again, if you guys remember, I said when I do set Azure subscription name, and then current storage account, I'm basically saying instead of that vShacked Azure VM storage account that we created a few minutes ago, I'm just going to switch over and I'm going to use our PW Training storage account. Okay, so I know I've already got VMs there that work. They've actually got OSs on them and everything. So I'm going to go ahead and use that storage account for these next couple of demos here. Okay. What I'm going to do here is I'm going to say that I want to create a new VM or a new image this time. So you guys remember last time, again, we did that add Azure disk. This time I want to say add Azure VM image. And I'm actually going to change this here because I want this PW Training. And then I want to switch this one from virtual machines to VHDs. And from development VM, let me just pick one of these other ones here. We'll pick BI Bootcamp, BI Bootcamp.vhd. Yep, okay. So what I'm going to do here is I'm going to hop back over just to show you that this VM or that this image doesn't already exist. I'll actually give it a different name here. So I already have one here called BI Bootcamp. So we'll go ahead and we'll actually change the name here. So we've got this one's going to be called Azure VM Demo Image. So you see Azure VM Demo Image doesn't exist in here. If I go over to my disk, scroll over to this very last page here, it also doesn't exist over here at the very end. So this one doesn't actually exist anywhere inside of my Azure account at all. So this time again, instead of doing add Azure VM disk, we're going to say add Azure VM image. We're going to tell it the name of the image. Again, that's going to be what shows up inside this screen here on this VM images. And then we're going to tell it where that file is actually stored. It's going to be in my PW training, VHDs, BI Bootcamp. Alrighty, and it did not like that one. Okay, apparently that one is not actually generalized, so it's not going to let me use that one. Let me see if the SP 2013 one works here, and if not, we'll just use one of those existing images there. VHD, and we'll copy this one. And let's see if this one will work for us. It may, these two may already actually be able, they were actually already tied over to VHDs that are in there. So essentially that didn't exactly work how I wanted it to, but what that will do once you tie that into an image that's not already in use here, you'll see that actually show up on the list of VM images here going forward. Okay. So the next piece here, we're going to use one of these existing items inside of here. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to switch over. I've got some other scripts here, and I'll walk you through each one of these. So let me go ahead and just switch my my location here. Okay. And what I'm going to show you how to do here is actually spin up. So we're going to take one of these existing images that we've already got, and I'm actually going to spin up a few VMs. So I've got this PowerShell script that I'm going to use here called createvms.ps1. And if we look at this script here, what we're going to do is we've got a couple of different parameters and everything inside of here. But basically what we're going to do is we're going to create a VM called SharePoint BI. We're going to set a couple other parameters like the username and password, some of those little pieces of information there. So this means whenever I start up the VM, my username is going to be called student, the password for it is going to be pass@word1. I have to tie this into a cloud service. That's kind of a separate topic that we don't really have time for today, but you do have to have a cloud service already created there. And then the image that I'm going to base this off of is going to be that SharePoint BI class image. Okay? So if we go over here into our Azure account, you'll see I've already got this image here called SharePoint BI class. Okay, so that's the image that I was trying to that failed in that previous script there that I was trying to reference a gist that was already in use as an image there. But basically what this is going to do for me is say that I want to, because this is also parameterized here, I want to loop over however many times, so the default here is going to be 3. I want to loop over and I want to create 3 different copies of this VM. They're all going to be called SharePoint BI and then some number. So it's going to be SharePoint BI1, SharePoint BI2, SharePoint BI3, and each one of those is going to have the same login. It's going to be student, and it's going to be pass@word01 is going to be my password. Okay, so I'm going to go ahead and run this particular script here, and I'm going to tell it that I want to create 3 VMs. So we're going to run this script. Again, it's going to loop over. It's going to create 3 different VMs based off that image of SharePoint BI class. It's going to call each one of those VMs SharePoint BI and then some number, and then those are going to be my login credentials for it. So I'm going to go ahead and run this. There we go. And that's probably going to take just a minute for us here, but if we hop over to instances, we'll see which one this is going to create here. So the name of the VM that's going to create, again, is SharePoint BI. So if I come inside of here and I Let me refresh the screen here. Once this gets done refreshing, I'm going to look for SharePoint BI inside of my window here. Okay, so go to the next page. So there's that SharePoint BI1 image. Okay, so that's the one that's creating right now, VM called SharePoint BI1. And then that's SharePoint BI1. You'll see that the status there is starting. Here in just a moment, hopefully it doesn't take too long here, but here in just a moment you'll see that this thing is going to say that it completed, and then it's going to move on to VM number 2. And it's going to start creating SharePoint BI2. This is doing, oh, I think it actually just switched there. So operation complete, create deployment SharePoint BI1. See, it's already done creating, and now it's going to go in and start creating the VM SharePoint BI2. So let me go ahead and refresh the screen again for us. And I'll show you some of the other things that this is doing in here in the background as well. And this, again, really, this is the power of those images. This is what doing that generalize and running that out-of-box experience piece is going to do for us. The only reason that we're able to do that is because before we uploaded this SharePoint BI image, we actually went in, we generalized it, and we ran the out-of-box experience, and we allowed it to be uploaded therefore as an image. So images, again, are the ones that are reusable. Disks are not reusable. Okay, so that one's still in the process of doing that. Oh, there showed up SharePoint BI2. So you'll see it'll go through the same process. It'll create SharePoint BI2. It'll get that started, and then it'll do SharePoint BI3. Now, again, these are all being created off this one image right here. So we've already got SharePoint installed. We've already got SQL Server installed. We've already got all that stuff configured. I've already got some demo scripts and everything already on that VM. So every one of my students in my class are going to have the exact same experience whenever they log in. If we go over here in the background, you can actually see it's creating some other objects here as well. So even though we only uploaded the image there, you can see that it's actually creating individual disks for those VMs based off of that image. And there you can see it actually just popped over to SharePoint BI3 there. So if we hop over, you'll see it's already created those two. So even though we only have one image in the background here, it's obviously creating multiple copies of that image, and you can see that each one of these individual VM instances is tied to one of those individual disks here. Okay. So again, no images are created here. In addition to that, we are going to have at the end of this whole thing, you'll see SharePoint BI3 there. I can then click on any of these individually. I can click connect, and it's going to download a little remote desktop file and allow me to run that and then log into that virtual machine. Okay, so I can now take this remote desktop file. If we go into my downloads here, I can now take that remote desktop file and say, well, Liz is going to be one of the students in my class, so I can email this RDP file for SharePoint BI1 over to Liz, and then she can just double-click on it on any computer, and she can log into that virtual machine. So there's one last thing I want to show you guys here before we wrap up. One of the cool things here before I show you the automation piece is now that I have these images inside of here, if I go to new and then I tell it I want to create a virtual machine, I can say from gallery. And inside the gallery here, you have all these pre-built VMs that Microsoft has put out there for us that have SharePoint, that have SQL Server, that have any of those things on. The cool thing about uploading images is we now have this section over here called My Images. And there's that SharePoint BI class. So I can click on this one here, and I can go to my next screen, and I can give it a name of SharePoint BI1, or it won't let me do that because I've already created that. But essentially, all those different settings that we created inside that little PowerShell file are now the same things that we would do here through the UI. So I only have to create that image one time, and I can either spin up additional VMs using PowerShell, or I can just have my users come out here, say create new VM, and then go look in the gallery and find that same image inside the gallery. Okay. The last thing I'm going to show you guys here before we wrap up here is the automation piece. So let me find my automation inside of here. And this is really one of the most powerful things that we have inside of inside Azure. So inside my training section here, I have what are called runbooks. And runbooks are basically just a set of operations that we want to perform. So the first thing we're always going to do is we're going to connect to Azure, but then I've got these two different options in here. One of them is to turn my VMs on, the other one is to turn my VMs off. So I'm going to go ahead and click on one of these here. So power VMs on, and you'll see that I have this scheduled to run every single morning at about 7 a.m., so 6:59, 59 a.m. If I come over here into the author screen, the reason I'm not going to run through how to actually do this with you guys is it's way more steps than what this actually is going to look like inside of here. But I will post a link. Devin Knight, he has a really great blog on how to actually do this. It runs through every single step that you have to do. But down here at the very bottom, we really have the meat of this whole thing. And what we're saying here is that we're gonna get the date, and we're gonna check the day of the week here, and we're gonna say on every day except for Saturday and Sunday, I want to go into my training, my PW training service there, and I want to turn on all of my virtual machines. So what this is going to do is it's going to say, well, you know, Devin knows that this week we happen to be doing an SSAS class. So he's going to go out there, he's going to spin up a VM for all the students inside of whatever classes need that. And then on Monday morning, it's going to come out here and it's going to automatically start up every single one of those VMs. So that way when we start class at 9 a.m., all the VMs are ready. Same thing is going to happen on Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday. When we get to the weekend, though, because we don't teach our classes on weekends, we know we don't need to start those up. We don't need to pay for those resources. So we're not going to worry about turning those on Saturday or Sunday. Then at the same time, somewhere around 8 p.m., I believe this one runs here, we're going to go out there and we're going to tell it that we want to stop all the VMs that are running on the training service. Again, this way we don't end up spending more money than we need to on these virtual machines. You can't necessarily do that quite as easily on your on-prem data sources there, because you still have to have that hardware that's running those VMs running at all times there. Okay, so we can really take the automation piece there and kind of take this, take all your Azure VM stuff to the next level there. Okay, so just a quick recap here as we're wrapping up. So get ready for your migration. Again, everything has to be a VHD. Maximum disk size of 127 gigs. If you want to use an image, essentially be able to duplicate the VM, you have to run that generalization using the out-of-box experience from SysPrep. If you only want to do a disk, which is a one-time use, you don't have to run that. On the Azure side, you obviously need your account, and you have to create the storage account and then create the storage container, upload your VM, go into Azure, run one of those two commands, either to create the image or create the disk, and then run your create virtual machine command there. And then obviously if you want to, you can use some of the PowerShell automation pieces there. And again, I will post all those scripts and everything in the link to Devin's automation blog there as well later on. So I know there's quite a few questions that we've gotten throughout this. Whenever I do the blog post here in the next day or so to post all the scripts and everything, I'll also put a Q&A section inside of there so that we can get all those questions answered. And I'll post that out there. You can see my blog URL is there on the screen, just at bradleyshack.com. I'll be sure to get that up before the end of the day on Thursday for sure. Okay.
All right.
Liz, I'll go ahead and hand it back over to you.
All right, great. Thanks everybody for attending. As always, the session will be posted by the end of the week on the website. Look in your email tomorrow to receive a link to that. If you have any questions in between now and then, please feel free to email Brad there on the screen. Thanks everybody.